Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Location: Katmai National Park, Alaska. Date: September 28, 2017. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Benjamin stood at the window of the ranger station, watching water sheet down the glass in patterns that never quite repeated. Beyond the blurred transparency, the landscape of Katmai stretched in shades of gray and green, the kind of green that only exists in coastal Alaska, so deep it's almost black when the clouds hang low. The spruce and hemlock forests vanished into mist 100 yards from the building, as if the world simply ended there and began again somewhere beyond sight. He'd been with the Park Service for 7 years now, the last 4 here at Katmai. Long enough to know the rhythms of this place, the way the seasons moved through it like breath through lungs. September was transition time, the salmon runs tapering off, the bears fattening themselves into stupor before the long sleep, the tourists gone except for the hardiest few who came for the solitude and the rain. Benjamin understood that impulse. There was something cathedral-like about these forests in autumn, something that made you speak in whispers if you spoke at all. He poured his 3rd cup of coffee, steam rising to join the condensation already forming on the inside of the windows. The station was warm, almost too warm, the propane heater working overtime against the damp that wanted to seep into everything. His uniform shirt was dry, but would be soaked within 5 minutes of stepping outside. That was the reality of late September in Katmai. You were either inside and dry or outside and wet with no middle ground. The radio crackled. "Morning, Ben. How's the Brooks Camp situation looking?" Sarah's voice from dispatch in King Salmon, 40 miles and a world away. Benjamin keyed the handset. "Morning, Sarah. Brooks is quiet. Had 2 campers pack out yesterday. Weather forecast hasn't scared off the diehards yet. But give it another day of this and I think we'll be down to 0. Roger that. We've got 1 vehicle still logged at the trailhead parking for the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Subaru Outback, Washington plates. Permit says 3-day solo hike, due back this afternoon." Benjamin checked his clipboard, running his finger down the permit log. "Got it. Zoe Castellanos, 27, Seattle. Experienced hiker according to her form. Left 2 days ago, planned route through the Ash Valley and back via Baked Mountain Trail. Keep an eye out. This rain's been pushing the creeks up. Some of those crossings are going to be tricky." "Will do. She's got a spot beacon on her equipment list, so if she gets into trouble, we'll know." "Copy. Stay dry if you can." That's the dream. Benjamin hung the handset back on its cradle and returned to the window. Somewhere out there, beneath all that rain and mist, Zoe Castellanos was presumably making her way back toward civilization. He'd met her briefly when she came in for her permit. A slight woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. The kind of hiker who asked intelligent questions about bear protocols and creek conditions. She'd had good gear, quality boots that showed wear but not abuse. She knew what she was doing, or at least gave every appearance of it. Still, 3 days alone in the backcountry during a storm like this. Benjamin had done it himself more times than he could count, but he never stopped respecting the 1,000 ways the wilderness could kill you if you made one wrong decision. Hypothermia, a fall on slick rocks, a creek crossing misjudged by 6 inches. The mountains didn't care about your experience level or your quality gear. They were indifferent, and indifference could be more dangerous than malice. He spent the morning on routine tasks, checking the supply inventory, updating the incident log, monitoring the weather station readouts. Wind from the southwest, steady at 12 knots with gusts to 20. Barometric pressure still falling. Temperature 41 degrees and dropping. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the forecast promised more of the same through the weekend. At noon, Benjamin made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the window, still watching the mist. The forests were so quiet. No birds called. They'd taken shelter somewhere, huddled in dense cover waiting out the deluge. Even the usual sounds of the woods, the creaking of trees and rustle of undergrowth, seemed muffled beneath the constant percussion of rain on roof, rain on earth, Rain on 10,000 leaves. He was rinsing his plate when the satellite phone rang. Benjamin dried his hands and picked up. Katmai Ranger Station, this is Benjamin. Ben, it's Marcus. Marcus Yazzie, lead ranger for the Brooks Camp District. I'm at headquarters going through the trail camera footage from last week. Got something weird I wanted to run by you. What kind of weird? Camera 14, the one we mounted on the Valley Trail about 3 miles in. It's motion activated, right? Should only trigger for animals or people. Right. I've been getting triggers every night for the past 5 nights. Same time between 10 and 11 p.m., but there's nothing on the footage. Benjamin frowned. Nothing? Could be a technical glitch. Moisture in the sensor, maybe. That's what I thought, but the camera's functioning fine otherwise. Captures bears, moose, even got a wolverine 2 days ago. But these nighttime triggers? Just empty trail. Well, not empty exactly. The trees are moving like something just passed through, but there's nothing there. A small cold thread worked its way down Benjamin's spine, the kind of feeling that has nothing to do with temperature. Which camera did you say? 14, on the Valley Trail. That's on Zoe Castellanos' route. Silence on the line for a moment. The solo hiker? Yeah. She's due back this afternoon. Probably nothing, Marcus said, but his voice carried a note that suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. Just wanted you to know. Keep an ear on the radio in case she calls in. Will do. Benjamin hung up and looked at the clock. 12:47 p.m. Zoe's permit listed her expected return time as between 2 and 4 p.m., accounting for weather delays. Still well within the window. Nothing to worry about yet. He tried to return to his paperwork but found himself distracted, his eyes drifting to the window every few minutes. The mist had thickened, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet. The world had contracted to just the station and the small circle of visible ground around it. Everything beyond that dissolved into gray uncertainty. At 2:30, Benjamin put on his rain gear and did a perimeter check of the station, more to occupy himself than from any real necessity. The rain drummed against his hood, ran down his neck despite the supposedly waterproof collar. He checked the generator, the propane tanks, the bear-proof garbage enclosure. Everything in order. Everything normal. Except for the silence. It struck him as he stood beside the generator shed, listening. The rain made noise, yes. A constant white static that filled the air. But beneath it, there should have been other sounds. The forest should not have been this quiet, even in a storm. Even with the birds sheltered and the animals hunkered down, there should have been something. The creak of branches, the gurgle of water finding its channels, the tick of cooling metal from the generator. But there was nothing. Just rain. Just that endless, suffocating hiss. Benjamin completed his circuit and returned to the station, shaking water from his jacket. He was being paranoid. The weather was affecting him, that was all. 3 days of rain would make anyone jumpy. He checked the radio. No calls. He checked his email on the satellite link. Nothing urgent. He checked the spot beacon monitoring system, the GPS tracker that would show any distress signals from registered devices in the park. All clear. At 3:45, with Zoe now 15 minutes past her earliest expected return time, Benjamin made fresh coffee and told himself there was no reason to worry yet. Hiking in rain took longer. She might have decided to wait out the worst of the weather under a rock overhang somewhere. She might have taken a wrong turn and added an hour to her route. All perfectly normal scenarios. At 4:30, with Zoe now officially late, he called dispatch. Sarah, it's Ben. Our solo hiker hasn't reported back yet. Copy. How late is she? 30 minutes past her latest expected return. Not emergency territory yet, but wanted you aware. Acknowledged. Keep me posted. If she's not back by 6, we'll start thinking about next steps. Benjamin spent the next hour and a half trying not to stare at the door, willing it to open and reveal Zoe Castellanos, wet and tired, but safe. At 5:00, he walked out to the trailhead parking area, A 10-minute hike through dripping forest. The Subaru Outback sat alone in the gravel lot, rain bouncing off its roof, Washington plates just as the log had noted. He cupped his hands to peer through the windows. Camping gear in the back, a book on the passenger seat, an air freshener shaped like a pine tree hanging from the mirror. He returned to the station and called dispatch at exactly 6 p.m. "She's not back." "Okay." Sarah's voice had shifted into professional mode, the casual friendliness replaced by focus. "Let's start the protocol. You want to do an initial search tonight or wait for morning?" Benjamin looked at the window, full dark now, or as close to it as made no difference with the cloud cover. The rain continued its relentless assault. "I'll do a preliminary sweep of the most likely routes. 2, maybe 3 hours. If I don't find sign of her, we'll organize a full search at first light. Be careful out there. Always am." He geared up. Headlamp, GPS, first aid kit, emergency blanket, radio, satellite phone, his service sidearm, which he rarely wore but seemed appropriate tonight for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. He left at 6:30, stepping out into a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. 2 days earlier, Zoe had stood at this same trailhead, adjusting the straps of her pack in the drizzle, excited despite the weather. 3 days alone in Katmai. 3 days to think, to breathe, to exist without the constant digital hum of Seattle surrounding her. She'd planned this trip for 8 months, studying maps, reading trip reports, waiting for her vacation time to align with the season. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes wasn't a difficult hike, not really. Volcanic ash and pumice underfoot, moonscape terrain that looked like nowhere else on Earth. She'd done harder. She'd backpacked through the North Cascades, climbed 3 of Washington's volcanoes, spent a week in the winds of Wyoming. She knew how to filter water, hang a bear bag, navigate by compass when the GPS failed. The first day had been perfect, or as perfect as hiking in steady rain could be. The ash valley spread out around her like a gray ocean frozen mid-wave, the pumice crunching under her boots, steam vents rising in the distance like ghosts of the 1912 eruption that had created all this. She'd camped that night beside a clear stream, the sound of water over rocks lulling her to sleep. The second day she'd continued deeper into the backcountry, following the route she'd planned. The rain intensified, but that was fine. She had good gear. She knew how to stay dry, or dry enough. The mist came and went, sometimes opening to reveal stunning vistas of mountains and ash fields, sometimes closing in until she could barely see 20 feet ahead. It was late afternoon on the second day when she first heard the crying. Zoe stopped mid-step, her boot hovering over a puddle. The sound came from somewhere ahead and to her left, muffled by rain and mist, but unmistakable. A child crying. Not screaming, not shouting, just crying. The kind of exhausted, hopeless sobbing that made something in her chest clench with instinctive concern. She stood still, listening. The sound continued for perhaps 10 seconds, then stopped. "Hello?" she called. Her voice seemed to die in the mist, absorbed by the rain. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Nothing. Just the rain. Zoe checked her map. There were no other permit holders scheduled in this area. The Brooks Camp Ranger, Benjamin, she remembered his name, had been very clear about that. She was the only person in this section of the park, which meant either someone had come in without a permit or what? A lost child? Out here? Impossible. She waited another minute, listening. When the crying didn't resume, she continued hiking, but a small knot of unease had formed in her stomach. The sound had been so clear, so distinctly human, and so distinctly a child. She hiked for another hour, covering perhaps 2 miles. The terrain grew rockier, the trail winding through low hills covered in dwarf birch and willow. The crying came again, this time from behind her. Zoe spun around, scanning the mist. "Hello? Where are you?" The crying continued for a moment longer, then cut off abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt wrong. She stood motionless, rain running down her face, every sense straining. Nothing moved. No child appeared through the mist. No footsteps approached. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself. Sound could do strange things in fog and rain. She'd probably heard a bird, a raven or something, and her brain had interpreted it as human. That made sense. That was rational. She hiked on, but faster now, wanting to reach her planned campsite before dark. The crying followed her, never close, always at the edge of hearing, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, once from so far to her right, it couldn't possibly have been the same source. By the time she reached the campsite, a small flat area beside another stream, her hands were shaking as she set up her tent. Not from cold, from something else. Something she didn't want to name. The crying stopped once the tent was up. Zoe made dinner, her camp stove hissing in the rain, and ate without tasting the food. She kept her headlamp on, pointed out into the darkness, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did. She climbed into her sleeping bag fully dressed, telling herself it was because of the cold. She was asleep within minutes, exhaustion overriding unease. She woke to the sound of her name. Zoe. Soft. Almost a whisper. Coming from just outside the tent. She lay rigid in her sleeping bag, heart hammering. The voice had been female, she thought. Or maybe male. Or maybe neither. It had been wrong somehow, the syllables stretched too long, the tone not quite matching any human voice she'd ever heard. Zoe. Again. Closer. Who's there? Her voice cracked. Silence. Long enough that she began to think she'd imagined it. Then, help me, Zoe. She grabbed her flashlight with numb fingers and unzipped the tent fly, shining the light out into the darkness. Rain, trees, nothing else. Where are you? Here. The voice came from the direction of the stream. I fell. I'm hurt. Please help. Zoe's training warred with her instincts. If someone was injured, she had to help. That was basic human decency, basic wilderness ethics. But every nerve in her body screamed that something was wrong, that she should stay in the tent, zip it closed, wait for morning. I'm coming, she called, and hated how her voice shook. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her first aid kit, and climbed out of the tent into the rain. The stream was 30 feet from her campsite. Tumbling over rocks in the darkness, she swept her flashlight back and forth along the banks, looking for an injured hiker, a fallen climber, anything that would explain the voice. Nothing. Hello? Zoe. Right behind her. She spun, and for just a moment, less than a second, a fragment of perception. She saw something at the edge of her flashlight beam. Something that might have been a person, or might have been something else. Something with two long limbs and eyes that reflected light wrong, and a mouth that opened too wide. Then it was gone, and she was alone in the rain, her breath coming in gasps, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. Zoe ran, back to her tent, scrambling inside, zipping the fly shut with fingers that wouldn't quite obey her. She sat in the darkness, listening to the rain, listening to her own racing heartbeat, listening for the voice. It didn't come again that night, but she didn't sleep either. Oh. Benjamin's headlamp cut a cone of light through the rain and darkness, illuminating perhaps 15 feet of trail at a time. Everything beyond that was void. He'd been hiking for 40 minutes, following the valley trail toward the most likely point where Zoe would be returning. His radio crackled, making him jump. Unit 7, this is dispatch. Go ahead, Sarah. Any sign of her? Negative. I'm about 3 miles in. Still have another mile to the junction point. Copy. Be advised, we're getting some weird reports from other areas of the park. Might be related, might not. Benjamin stopped walking. What kind of reports? Campers at Dumpling Mountain called in about 20 minutes ago. Said they heard someone calling for help near their site, but when they went to investigate, no one was there. They're pretty spooked. The cold thread down his spine again, stronger now. Did they describe the voice? Said it sounded like a child crying, then calling for help. But here's the thing. They said it knew their names, called out to them specifically. Benjamin's hand tightened on the radio. What did you tell them? Told them to stay in their tents, don't investigate further. I've got Marcus heading their way now. She paused. Ben? What's going on out there? He should have said he didn't know. He should have stuck to procedure, to rationality, to the kinds of explanations that made sense in incident reports. Instead, he found himself saying, "Have you ever heard of Kushtaka?" Silence on the radio for a long moment. Then, "Yeah, my grandmother told stories, Tlingit legends. Why?" "Just wondering." He keyed off before she could ask more questions. Kushtaka. The word felt heavy in his mind, laden with implications he didn't want to examine too closely. He'd heard the stories 2 years ago, from an old ranger who'd grown up in a Tlingit village near Juneau. Shapeshifters that lived near water, that could take the form of otters or humans or something in between. They mimicked voices, lured people away from safety, led them into rivers where they'd be transformed. Lost, never found. Just stories. Folklore. The kind of tales every wilderness culture told to keep children from wandering too far from camp to explain the unexplainable. Except for the empty trail camera footage. Except for the campers at Dumpling Mountain. Except for the fact that Zoe Castellanos, an experienced hiker with good gear and good sense, was now 4 hours overdue and somewhere in these dark, rain-soaked forests. Benjamin continued hiking, his senses hyper-alert now. The rain continued its monotonous drum against his hood. The trail wound through forest so thick his headlamp beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the undergrowth. Several times he stopped, certain he'd heard something. A footstep, a branch breaking, a voice, but each time there was only rain, only darkness. At the 4-mile mark, he found her first camp. The tent was still standing, properly staked, the fly taut and undamaged. Her pack leaned against a tree, covered with its rain cover. Everything looked normal, orderly, exactly how a responsible backpacker would leave a camp. Except Zoe wasn't there. Benjamin approached slowly, announcing himself. "Zoe? Zoe Castellanos? This is Park Ranger Benjamin Chen. If you're here, please respond." Nothing. He unzipped the tent. Her sleeping bag was inside, along with some clothes, a book, a water filter. The tent was dry inside. She'd been here, had set up properly, and then... What left? Why would she leave her sleeping bag behind? Benjamin backed away from the tent and called dispatch. "Sarah, I found her camp at the 4-mile mark. Tent set up, gear present, but she's not here. Could she be out using the bathroom, maybe? Her sleeping bag is still in the tent. In this weather? Nobody hikes away from their bag. And her pack is here too. She wouldn't have gone far without her pack." Okay. We need to escalate this. I'm calling in a full search and rescue for First Light. Can you stay there tonight, secure the scene?" Benjamin looked at the tent, at the dark forest pressing in from all sides. Every instinct told him to say no, to get back to the station where there were walls and light and the illusion of safety. But protocol was protocol. "I'll stay." He set up his own emergency bivouac near her tent, using a tarp to create a small sheltered area. He built no fire. Everything was too wet. But he had his stove for hot water. He made tea and drank it without tasting it, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond his headlamp's reach. At 9:47 p.m., he heard the crying. It started soft, almost below the threshold of hearing. A child's voice sobbing, heartbroken. Benjamin stood up slowly, his hand dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Not his gun. He didn't know why, but the bear spray felt right in a way the gun didn't. The crying continued, moving through the forest, perhaps 50 yards from his position. Circling, not approaching, not retreating, just present. "Who's there?" His voice came out steady, authoritative. "Good. This is a closed area. Identify yourself." The crying stopped. In its place, a new voice, female, strained, familiar, even though he'd only heard it once 2 days ago. Benjamin, please help me, I'm lost." Zoe's voice, exactly Zoe's voice, with that slight Seattle accent, that particular cadence, but wrong, stretched, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. Where are you, Zoe? I don't know. I can't see. Everything is dark. Please, I'm so cold. Benjamin grabbed his flashlight and swept the forest. Nothing. Just trees and rain and darkness. Stay where you are. Keep talking so I can find you. I'm trying, but I can't. Benjamin, there's something wrong with the forest. The trees keep moving, the trail keeps changing. I've been walking for hours, but I'm still in the same place. His blood ran cold. Those weren't the words of a lost hiker. Those were the words of someone experiencing something else entirely, something that shouldn't be possible. Zoe, I need you to activate your emergency beacon. Press the SOS button on your spot device. Can you do that? I don't have it. I don't have anything. I don't remember. When did I lose my pack? Benjamin, when did I lose my pack? The voice was starting to sound less like Zoe and more like something else. The words came with pauses in wrong places, emphasis on wrong syllables. Whatever was speaking was losing its grip on the mimicry, or maybe it didn't care anymore about maintaining the illusion. I don't think you're Zoe, Benjamin said quietly. Silence, long and heavy, then laughter. Not human laughter, something that started as laughter and descended into a sound that belonged to no human throat. A chittering, warbling noise that made his skin crawl and his stomach clench. The sound moved through the forest, impossibly fast, circling his position. He spun, trying to track it, but it came from everywhere and nowhere. His headlamp caught glimpses, movement between trees, something sleek and wrong, too low to the ground to be human but moving upright in ways that animals didn't move. Benjamin. His own name in his mother's voice now. His mother who'd been dead for 3 years. Benjamin, why didn't you come? I waited so long. I called and called, but you never came. You're not real. He said it loudly, firmly, as much to himself as to whatever was out there. My mother is dead. You're not her. Not real. The voice shifted again, became something that might have been Zoe or might have been nothing human. Not real, not real. But she was real. Is real. Will be real. Time is different in the water, Benjamin. Time is different when you change. Where is she? Where is Zoe? Everywhere. Nowhere. Becoming. She fought so hard, Benjamin. She screamed your name. Did you hear? Were you listening? He hadn't been. 2 days ago, while whatever this was had taken Zoe Castellanos, he'd been at the ranger station drinking coffee, filing paperwork, living his normal life. While she'd been dragged into whatever nightmare this was. The chittering sound came again, closer now. Benjamin pulled his bear spray, held it ready. Show yourself. Would you like that? Would you like to see? We could show you what she saw. We could show you what happens when the river takes you. When the change begins, when you realize you're becoming something else and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Movement at the edge of his light. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to perceive. Something wet and dark. Something with too many joints. Something that reflected his headlamp beam with eyes that weren't animal and weren't human. She's at the river, it said. And now the voice was a perfect copy of his own, Benjamin speaking to Benjamin. She's at the river waiting for you. She wants to show you how the water feels. She wants to teach you how to swim the deep places where the light doesn't reach. Don't you want to see her again? Don't you want to help? No. Liar. The voice held amusement now, cruel and ancient. You're already wondering, already thinking about it. What if she's still alive? What if you could save her? What if you just walked down to the river, just looked, just... Benjamin triggered the bear spray, aiming at where he'd seen the movement. The stream of capsaicin shot out into the darkness, and something shrieked. Not a human scream, not an animal cry, but something in between, something that hurt to hear. The forest fell silent. He stood there, spray canister still extended, breathing hard, waiting. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Nothing moved. The rain continued falling. The darkness pressed in from all sides. Very slowly, Benjamin backed toward his bivouac. He didn't turn his back on the forest. He didn't lower the spray. When he reached his tarp, he crawled inside and sat with his back against a tree, the spray in one hand and his radio in the other. "Sarah," he whispered into the radio. "Sarah, are you there?" Static, pure static. He checked the battery. Full. Checked the channel. Correct. Tried again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, do you copy?" The static resolved into a voice, his own voice. "We copy, Unit 7. We're right here. We've always been here. Waiting." He shut off the radio and sat in the darkness, listening to the rain, listening to his own heartbeat, listening for the sound of something approaching through the forest. It didn't come for him that night, but he heard it, moving through the trees, circling his position again and again, patient as stone, hungry as time. Au dawn came gray and dim, the rain finally tapering to drizzle. Benjamin emerged from his bivouac stiff and exhausted, having not slept at all. His radio worked again, crackling to life with Sarah's genuinely concerned voice. Ben, we lost contact with you last night. What happened?" "Radio malfunction." The lie came easily. What else could he say? "I'm at the campsite. Need a search team here as soon as possible." "They're already mobilizing. Should be at your position by 8. He waited, sipping cold coffee from his thermos, staring at Zoe's tent. In the gray morning light, it looked so normal, so mundane. A blue tent in a forest clearing, slightly damp from rain. Nothing sinister, nothing impossible. Except he knew Zoe Castellanos wasn't coming back. Not the Zoe who had smiled at him 2 days ago, who had asked intelligent questions about bear safety, who had been excited about 3 days alone in the wilderness. That Zoe was gone. The search and rescue team arrived at 8:15, 6 people including Marcus, all experienced wilderness responders. They spread out in a grid pattern, searching the area around the camp. Benjamin joined them, though he felt hollow inside, going through motions he knew were futile. At 10:30, one of the searchers called out, "Found something!" They converged on the location, a small stream perhaps 200 yards from the camp. The searcher, a woman named Jennifer, pointed at the muddy bank. Footprints, human footprints small enough to be Zoe's, leading into the water, but not coming out on the other side. "The current's not strong enough to wash them away," Jennifer said, frowning. "She should have left prints on the far bank." They searched up and down the stream for half a mile in both directions. No exit prints, no signs of her emerging from the water. It was as if she'd walked into the stream and simply ceased to exist. Marcus stood beside Benjamin at the water's edge. "What the hell happened here?" Benjamin watched the water flow past, dark and cold and ancient. Beneath the surface, something caught his eye. A flash of movement there and gone. It might have been a fish. It might have been an otter. It might have been something else entirely. "I don't know," he said quietly. They searched for 3 more days. Helicopters when the weather cleared, dog teams, volunteers from King Salmon and Anchorage. They found nothing else. No body, no gear scattered by a fall, no signs of animal predation. Nothing. The official report listed Zoe Castellanos as missing, presumed drowned. An accident, tragic but explicable. These things happened in the wilderness. People got disoriented, made bad decisions, stepped wrong, and were swept away by currents stronger than they looked. Benjamin signed off on the report. He didn't mention the voices. He didn't mention what he'd seen at the edge of his light. He didn't mention the conversation with something that wasn't human, that spoke with stolen voices and promised transformation in dark water. He requested a transfer 3 weeks later. The request was denied. Budget constraints, staffing shortages, the usual bureaucratic reasons. He would remain at Katmai through the end of the season. On his last patrol before the winter closure, he found himself at the stream where Zoe's footprints had disappeared. He stood on the bank, looking down into the water. It was clear enough to see the stones on the bottom, the small fish darting between rocks. And something else. Something that might have been shadows, might have been movement, might have been nothing at all. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The water flowed past, indifferent, eternal. If it heard, it gave no sign. But as Benjamin turned to leave, he could have sworn he heard something behind him. A woman's voice carried on the wind and rain. Benjamin. He didn't turn around. He walked back to the station, filed his final report, and when the season ended, he flew back to Anchorage and took the first job he could find that kept him away from wilderness, away from forests, away from water. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears it. The crying sound. The voice that knows his name. The chittering laughter that comes from throats that belong to neither man nor animal. And he wonders if Zoe Castellanos is still out there, somewhere between human and something else, swimming in deep places where the light doesn't reach, waiting for the next hiker to hear the crying and come to investigate, waiting for someone to help. Location: Congaree National Park, South Carolina. Date: August 17, 2019. The cypress trees stood like ancient pillars in water the color of strong tea, their knees breaking the surface in knobbed clusters that seemed almost deliberate, almost architectural. Marcus Webb had walked the boardwalk loop 17 times that week, his 8th year as a ranger at Congaree National Park, and he still found something new to notice each time. Today it was the way the Spanish moss hung motionless in the thick air, gray-green curtains that didn't sway even slightly, despite the approaching weather system churning somewhere over the Atlantic. The humidity sat on everything like a second skin. By 9 in the morning, his uniform shirt already clung to his back, and the radio on his belt felt heavier than it should. The forecast had been calling for the tropical storm since Wednesday. Tropical Storm Claudette, they'd named it, though the meteorologist couldn't agree on whether it would make landfall as far north as South Carolina or curve south toward Savannah. Either way, the park would feel it. Marcus could already smell the storm in the air, that particular scent of ozone and disturbed water, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The floodplain was already higher than normal for August. Another few inches, and they'd have to close the low boardwalk sections. Another foot, and they'd evacuate the backcountry campers entirely. He stopped at the intersection where the boardwalk split toward Weston Lake, checking his watch. 9:43. The morning had been quiet so far. 3 visitors on the early loop, all out by 8:30. A retired couple from Pennsylvania and a young woman who'd been sketching the bald cypress roots with impressive detail. She'd shown him her work when he'd passed. Intricate pen drawings that captured the way the trees seemed to grow directly from the water, their bases flaring like the hems of ball gowns. He'd complimented her technique, reminded her about the weather forecast, and continued his patrol. The radio crackled. "Unit 4, this is base." Marcus unclipped it from his belt. "Unit 4, go ahead. Just confirming you completed the morning loop. We've got a weather update. Claudette's tracking is looking more certain. National Weather Service is saying landfall around Charleston, late tonight or early tomorrow. We're implementing storm protocols as of 1400 hours. Copy that. Loop's clear. I'm heading back to check the primitive campsite registry. Roger. Be advised, we've got 1 overnight permit still active for Cedar Creek. Single camper, checked in yesterday afternoon." Marcus felt a small knot form in his stomach. Cedar Creek was one of the more remote sites, accessible only by a 2-mile trail that wound through some of the densest old-growth forest in the park. Beautiful spot, but it flooded fast when the water rose. "Do we have contact information?" "Affirmative. Allison Brenner, cell number on file. I tried calling 10 minutes ago. No answer. Probably no signal out there. I'll hike out and notify her in person. Storm protocols mean mandatory evacuation of backcountry sites, right?" "Correct. If she wants to stay, she'll need to move to the designated emergency shelter at Longleaf Campground. But honestly, Marcus, with the water rising, I'd recommend she leave the park entirely." "Understood. I'll head out there now. Should be back by 1300. "Copy. Stay safe out there." Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and adjusted his pack. 2 miles wasn't far, but in this heat and humidity, it would feel longer. He'd need to bring extra water for the camper too. If she'd been out there since yesterday, she might be running low, and the creek water definitely needed treatment before drinking, no matter how clear it looked. He returned to the ranger station, refilled his Camelback, grabbed 2 extra bottles, added a basic first aid kit and a park map with the emergency shelter locations marked. Standard procedure. The station was a small building with air conditioning that barely worked and a persistent smell of mildew that no amount of dehumidifying could eliminate. This was the low country after all. Everything stayed damp. Everything grew things. Moss, mold, mushrooms sprouting from places they shouldn't. Marcus had learned to accept it as part of the ecosystem, part of what made Congaree unique. 26,000 acres of old-growth bottomland hardwood forest, one of the last significant stands remaining in the United States. The trees here had been growing for centuries, some of them dating back to before European contact. Walking through Congaree was like walking through a cathedral built by time itself. He locked the station and headed for the Cedar Creek trailhead. The path started innocuously enough, a well-maintained dirt track that quickly narrowed and darkened as it entered the forest proper. The canopy closed overhead, laurel oak and sweet gum mixing with the towering loblolly pines that gave the region its name. Light filtered down in broken shafts, green gold and heavy with moisture. Within 100 yards, the sounds of the parking area and visitor center faded completely, replaced by the dense quiet of the swamp forest. Not silent, though. Never silent. Congaree was always alive with sound if you listened carefully. The high-pitched buzz of cicadas formed a constant background hum. Woodpeckers drummed in the distance. The sharp rat-a-tat of a pileated, probably, searching for beetles in dead wood. Frogs called from the water channels that crisscrossed the floodplain, a bass chorus that rose and fell in waves. And beneath it all, the subtle sounds of water itself, dripping, trickling, flowing through channels visible and invisible, the slow pulse of the wetland ecosystem. Marcus walked at a steady pace, watching the trail out of habit. Roots crossed the path in places, thick and gnarled, slick with moisture. Mushrooms grew in clusters, small brown ones, delicate white ones, and occasionally the bright orange of a chicken of the woods fungus, climbing a dead trunk like flames. He'd learned to identify most of them over the years, though he'd never been brave enough to try eating the edible varieties. Too many looked similar. Too easy to make a fatal mistake. The trail wound deeper into the forest, following the slight elevation changes that distinguished high ground from floodplain in this flat landscape. In places, boardwalks bridged standing water where the trail would otherwise be impassable. The wood was dark with age and moisture, the planks stamped with warnings about alligators and venomous snakes. Both were common here, though Marcus rarely saw them during the day. They had more sense than humans when it came to the heat. They found shade, stayed still, conserved energy. He was perhaps a mile in when he noticed the silence. It didn't happen all at once. The cicadas faded first, their buzz diminishing gradually until he realized he'd been walking for several minutes without hearing them at all. Then the frogs stopped, then the birds. Marcus slowed his pace, listening. This happened sometimes when a predator moved through, a bobcat or coyote, occasionally a black bear, though those were rare. The small creatures went quiet, waiting for danger to pass. But there was no sound of movement, no rustling in the undergrowth, no snap of twigs under heavy paws, just the absence of sound, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. Marcus stood still on the trail, barely breathing, extending his senses. The air felt heavier somehow, thicker. The light seemed dimmer, though the canopy hadn't changed. He could hear his own heartbeat, surprisingly loud in his ears. Could hear the slight rasp of his breathing, and beneath that, or perhaps imagined, a sound like breathing that wasn't his own. Slow, rhythmic, as if the forest itself had lungs. He shook his head slightly, annoyed at himself. 8 years in the park and he was getting spooked by natural silence. A predator had passed through, that was all. The sounds would return. He continued walking but found himself moving more quietly, stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs or scuffing the path. The silence persisted for another quarter mile before the first frog resumed calling, tentative at first. then joined by others. The cicadas started again. The forest exhaled, and Marcus realized he'd been holding tension in his shoulders that he now consciously relaxed. Nothing wrong. Just the woods being the woods. The Cedar Creek campsite sat in a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek itself, accessible by a narrow spur trail marked with a weathered wooden sign. Marcus had been there dozens of times. It was a popular spot for experienced campers who wanted solitude but didn't want to venture into the true backcountry sites that required navigation by compass and map. Cedar Creek had a fire ring, a cleared tent pad, and a bear box for food storage. Basic, but maintained. He could see the tent as soon as he entered the clearing. A small two-person model, dark green, pitched properly with the guy line secured and the rainfly attached despite the current lack of rain. Good camping practice. Whoever this Allison Brenner was, she knew what she was doing. The tent flap was closed. "Hello, the camp," Marcus called out using the traditional hiker's greeting. "Park ranger doing a wellness check." No response. He walked closer, noting the details automatically. A pair of hiking boots sat outside the tent, neatly placed. A small camp chair was set up near the fire ring, which contained the cold remains of a fire from last night. Burned down to white ash, properly extinguished. A stuff sack hung from the bear cable, probably containing food. Everything looked orderly, well organized. Nothing seemed wrong. "Ms. Brenner?" He stopped about 10 feet from the tent. "Allison Brenner. This is Park Ranger Marcus Webb. I need to talk to you about the weather forecast." Still no response. The tent didn't move. No sound of someone stirring inside. Marcus felt a prickle of concern. Maybe she was out hiking, exploring the area. But her boots were here, and hiking in the swamp in sandals or barefoot was asking for trouble. Too many roots, too many things that could cut or bite. He approached the tent and knocked on the aluminum pole near the entrance. "Ms. Brenner, are you in there?" He waited 10 seconds, then carefully unzipped the tent flap a few inches. "I'm opening your tent to check on your welfare. If you're in there, please respond." He pulled the flap wider and looked inside. Empty. The sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner, a small backpack propped against it. A headlamp hung from the tent's interior loop. A book, he could see it was a field guide to southern trees, lay on top of the sleeping bag. Everything packed and organized as if she'd stepped out for just a moment. But her boots were outside. Where would she have gone? Marcus straightened and scanned the campsite more carefully. No signs of disturbance. No indication of an animal getting into the camp. The stuff sack hanging from the bear cable was intact, showing she'd followed proper food storage protocols. He walked toward the creek, thinking maybe she'd gone to filter water or wash up, though the lack of boots still bothered him. The creek itself ran clear and dark, tannin-stained water moving sluggishly between cypress knees and over submerged logs. The water level was definitely higher than normal. He could see the high water marks on the tree trunks, showing where the creek had been earlier in the summer. In another 12 hours, with the storm surge and rainfall from Claudette, this area would be significantly flooded. "Allison," he called louder now, his voice carrying through the forest. "Allison Brenner. If you can hear me, please respond. This is Park Ranger Webb." He listened. Frogs, cicadas, the slow gurgle of creek water. No human voice. Marcus pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Unit 4. Static then. Go ahead, Unit 4. I'm at Cedar Creek campsite. The tent is here, set up and occupied, but the camper is not present. Boots are outside the tent, but I can't locate her in the immediate area." A pause. "Any signs of disturbance or emergency?" "Negative. Everything looks orderly. But she's not answering calls, and I can't see where she would have gone without her boots." "Copy. Do you want backup for a search?" Marcus checked his watch. 11:15. "Let me do a quick search of the immediate area first. She might have just gone for a short walk. I'll radio in 15 minutes with an update." "Roger that. We'll stand by." He clipped the radio back and began a systematic search of the area around the campsite, moving in concentric circles, looking for any sign of passage. The ground was soft in places, muddy in others, but he found no clear footprints. No broken vegetation suggesting someone had pushed through the undergrowth. No calls for help. No signs of injury. After 10 minutes, he expanded his search farther from the camp, following the creek upstream for 100 yards, then downstream for the same distance. Nothing. The forest simply absorbed her, left no trace. It was as if Allison Brenner had stepped out of her tent and vanished into the humid air. Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten. This wasn't right. People didn't just disappear. But in Congaree, in 26,000 acres of swamp forest where you could walk 50 feet off trail and be completely disoriented, where the water was rising and a storm was coming, yes, people could disappear. It happened. Not often, but it happened. He was about to radio base again when he noticed something. On a cypress tree about 30 yards from the campsite, at roughly eye level, something had been carved into the bark, not deeply, just scratched into the surface like someone had used a fingernail or a sharp stick. Marcus approached it slowly, an irrational sense of dread building in his chest. The carving was simple. 3 curved lines, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a simplified face. 2 marks for eyes and 1 for a mouth. But the mouth was wrong. It curved upward in a smile that was too wide, too sharp, like a crescent moon lying on its back. Below the face, a single word had been scratched. Riding. Marcus stared at the carving, a cold feeling spreading through him despite the oppressive heat. The marks looked fresh. The exposed wood was still pale, not yet darkened by moisture and oxidation. They could have been made today, could have been made last night. He'd never seen anything like this in the park before. Vandalism happened occasionally, initials carved in trees, spray paint on rocks. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, meaningful in a way he couldn't articulate. The face with its too wide smile seemed to be looking at him, and the word riding echoed in his mind with implications he didn't want to consider. His grandmother had been from the Low Country, from a small Gullah community outside Beaufort. She'd died when Marcus was 12, but he remembered the stories she used to tell. Old stories, passed down through generations that stretched back to West Africa. Stories that had evolved and changed in the humid darkness of the Carolina coast. Stories about things that moved at night. Things that weren't quite human anymore, if they ever had been. One story in particular came back to him now, unbidden. The story of the Boo Hag. He pushed the memory away. That was folklore. That was stories told to scare children. This was a real missing person in a real national park with a real storm approaching. He needed to focus on practical concerns, not on half-remembered tales from childhood. But the word riding stayed with him as he pulled out his radio. Base, this is Unit 4. I need to initiate a search and rescue operation. I'm marking this as a code yellow. Missing person, circumstances unclear. Allison Brenner had arrived at Cedar Creek campsite yesterday afternoon with a sense of relief that she hadn't expected to feel so intensely. The drive from Charlotte had taken 4 hours, and the last month of her life had been, she didn't even have a word for it. Suffocating, maybe. Crushing. Her father's funeral had been 3 weeks ago. The estate settlement was dragging on. Her sister wasn't speaking to her over a disagreement about their mother's care. And Marcus, different Marcus, her ex-boyfriend Marcus, had started dating someone new, posting pictures that kept appearing in Allison's social media feed no matter how many times she muted or blocked. She'd needed to get away, needed to be somewhere with no cell signal, no internet, no constant stream of other people's expectations and judgments. Somewhere she could just exist without having to perform or explain or justify. Congaree had seemed perfect, remote but not dangerous, beautiful but not crowded. She'd reserved the Cedar Creek site online, packed her gear with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that came from years of camping with her father, and driven south into the Low Country, with her windows down and her phone off. The hike to the campsite had been harder than she'd expected. The humidity was brutal, and her pack was heavier than it needed to be. She'd overpacked, as usual, bringing things just in case that she'd probably never use. But she'd made it, and the campsite was even better than the pictures online. The clearing was peaceful. shaded by massive trees that seemed to exist in a different time scale than human concerns. The creek burbled nearby, soothing and constant. She'd set up her tent efficiently, hung her food, built a fire, and cooked a simple dinner of rice and dehydrated vegetables. As the sun set and the forest darkened around her, she'd felt something like peace for the first time in weeks. The fire crackled, the frogs sang. The weight she'd been carrying seemed to lift just slightly. She'd read for a while by Headlamp, the field guide to southern trees that she'd bought specifically for this trip, wanting to identify the giants that surrounded her. Bald cypress, water tupelo, laurel oak, overcup oak, names that felt solid, ancient, real, in a way that legal documents and funeral arrangements didn't. By 9:30 she was exhausted, more tired than she'd realized. The heat and the hike had drained her. She'd banked the fire properly, checked that all her food was secure, and retreated to her tent. The sleeping bag felt clean and safe. The sound of the creek was hypnotic. She'd fallen asleep within minutes. And then, sometime in the deepest part of the night, she'd woken. Not suddenly. Not with the jolt of alarm that comes from a nightmare or a sudden noise. She'd woken slowly, consciousness rising like bubbles through dark water, and with it came the sensation that something was wrong. Her body felt heavy, impossibly heavy, as if the sleeping bag had become a lead blanket. She tried to move and couldn't. Her arms wouldn't respond to her commands. Her legs were numb, distant, barely part of her. Panic flickered in her mind, but even that felt muted, as if her emotions were happening somewhere far away. She could feel her heart beating, fast, too fast, but she couldn't seem to draw a full breath. Her chest felt compressed, squeezed by some enormous weight that she couldn't see. She tried to open her eyes, managed it barely. The tent interior was dark, the fabric walls barely visible in the faint starlight that filtered through the mesh windows. Everything looked normal. Nothing moved, but she could feel it. Something was wrong with the air itself. It felt thicker, harder to breathe, and there was a smell she couldn't identify. Something sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left in a vase too long. And then she heard the breathing, not her own labored attempts to fill her lungs. This was different. This was slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The breathing of something massive, something patient, something that had all the time in the world. It seemed to come from right above her, right on top of her, though she couldn't see anything when she rolled her eyes upward. Just the dark ceiling of the tent. But she could feel it. Weight pressing down on her chest. Weight that corresponded with each exhale of that slow, terrible breathing. As if something was sitting on her, using her, riding her like a horse that had no choice but to carry its burden. Allison tried to scream. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to thrash, to fight, to move anything, a finger, a toe, anything, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped in her own flesh, pinned beneath something she couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. The breathing continued. In, out, out. And with each exhale, she felt something being pulled from her. Not blood, not anything physical she could name, but something essential, something that made her her. It was being drawn out through her breath, stolen with each cycle of those enormous invisible lungs. Time stopped meaning anything. She might have been paralyzed for seconds or hours. All she knew was the breathing, the weight, the slow draining feeling of being emptied out like a vessel, and underneath her terror a strange thought surfaced. This has happened before. Not to her, but to others. Many others. This is old. This is what it does. Then, just as slowly as it had come, the weight lifted. The breathing stopped. The air in the tent suddenly felt normal again. Hot, humid, but breathable. Allison gasped, pulling in oxygen like someone who'd been underwater too long. Her body was her own again. She could move her fingers, curl her toes, turn her head. She lay there shaking, too terrified to do anything else. What had that been? A nightmare? Sleep paralysis? She'd heard of that, a condition where your mind wakes but your body remains in sleep paralysis, often accompanied by hallucinations and a sensation of pressure on the chest. That had to be it. Had to be. But the smell lingered, sweet and rotten, real. And outside her tent, very softly, she heard footsteps, not the sound of boots or shoes. This was something else, a soft padding sound, skin on dirt moving around the perimeter of her tent in a slow circle. Around and around, and with it a new sound that made her blood turn to ice. Humming. Someone was humming a tune she almost recognized. Something old and rhythmic, like a lullaby or a work song. The voice was female, but wrong somehow. The pitch wavered in ways human voices didn't, sliding between notes that had no names. Allison pulled the sleeping bag up to her chin, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The footsteps continued circling. The humming went on, around and around her tent, patient and methodical, like a predator establishing territory. She waited for it to stop, waited for morning, waited for anything to change, but the circling continued until the sky began to lighten. And only then, as the first bird started calling and the forest woke around her, did the footsteps finally move away, fading into the undergrowth with that same soft padding sound. Allison lay motionless until full daylight, then emerged from her tent on shaking legs to find her boots arranged neatly outside where she'd left them, and the morning looking completely normal. The fire ring was cold. The forest was peaceful. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had happened, except that she felt wrong, hollowed out, like something vital had been taken and not returned. And when she looked at the cypress tree 30 yards from her tent, she saw the carving that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, the face with its too wide smile, the single word, writing. She'd backed away from it slowly, fighting the urge to pack immediately and leave. But where would she go? Back to Charlotte? Back to the life that felt like it was crushing her? At least here the danger was honest, straightforward. At least here she could see it coming. Except she couldn't. Whatever had visited her tent last night, whatever had sat on her chest and stolen her breath, she hadn't seen it at all, had only felt it. And now it had marked the trees, marked her campsite, marked her. Allison had spent the morning trying to rationalize what happened. Sleep paralysis, stress, grief manifesting in strange ways. She'd forced herself to eat breakfast, to drink water, to act normal. She'd left her boots outside the tent because they were muddy. She'd taken her field guide and walked down to the creek in her camp sandals, trying to focus on tree identification, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something patient, something waiting for night to fall again. And now she stood by the creek, the field guide open in her hands to a page she wasn't reading, and she realized she'd been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes without moving. Time felt strange, thick. The forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, the frogs had stopped calling, and behind her, very softly, she heard footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. The same soft padding sound from last night, skin on dirt. Coming closer, Allison turned slowly, her field guide falling from her hands into the shallow water. There was nothing there, just the forest, just the trees, just the thick, humid air, and the sudden, complete silence. But she could feel it, right in front of her, right there, close enough to touch. And then she felt the breath on her face, slow, rhythmic, patient, and she opened her mouth to scream but found she couldn't make a sound, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there as the invisible weight pressed against her chest, and the breathing continued, in and out, stealing everything she was with each exhale. The last thing Allison Brenner saw before the forest swallowed her completely was her own reflection in the creek water. But the reflection was wrong. The reflection was smiling too wide, with a mouth like a crescent moon, and she realized with distant horror that the face in the water wasn't hers anymore. It was wearing her, and it was hungry. The search and rescue team arrived at Cedar Creek campsite by 1:30 in the afternoon. 3 rangers plus 2 volunteers from the local SAR unit, all experienced in wilderness search protocols. They spread out in a grid pattern, calling Allison's name, looking for any sign of passage or disturbance. Marcus led them through the same areas he'd already searched, pointing out the tent, the boots, the organized campsite. He showed them the carving on the cypress tree, though he didn't mention what it meant to him, what memories it stirred from his grandmother's stories. The team photographed it as potential evidence but didn't assign it much significance. Probably just vandalism, they agreed, unrelated to the missing person. By 3 o'clock, they'd expanded the search radius to half a mile. By 4, they'd found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of injury. It was as if Allison Brenner had simply ceased to exist. The storm was getting closer. Marcus could feel it in the air, in the way the light had turned yellow-green, in the way the wind had picked up just slightly, making the Spanish moss finally move after days of hanging still. They had maybe 3 or 4 hours before the outer bands of Claudette arrived. After that, the floodwaters would rise fast, and the search would have to be suspended until the storm passed. "We need to make a decision," said Janet Kowalski, the lead SAR coordinator. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of calm competence that came from decades of emergency response. "Do we pull out now and resume tomorrow? Or do we push through until conditions force us to stop?" Marcus looked at the sky. "If we leave now, we might not be able to get back here for 2 or 3 days. The water's already high. With the storm surge and rainfall, this whole area could be under 3 feet of water by morning. Which means if she's injured somewhere, lying low, she won't survive," Marcus finished. "I know." Janet nodded slowly. "Then we push until we can't anymore. But we stay in constant radio contact, and if I call retreat, everyone moves immediately. No heroes, agreed?" The team agreed. They spread out again, pushing deeper into the swamp forest, moving into areas where the trails disappeared entirely, and navigation became a matter of compass and instinct. The water was knee-deep in places now, forcing them to wade through murky channels where anything could be hidden beneath the surface. Cottonmouths, alligators, submerged logs that could trip you and hold you under. Marcus found himself in an area he'd only been to once before, years ago during a wildlife survey. The trees here were enormous, some of them with trunks 10 feet in diameter. Their bases flared into complex root systems that looked like the flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals. The canopy was so dense overhead that it felt like twilight even in mid-afternoon. The only light came in scattered beams that caught the humidity and turned the air visible, solid, like you could reach out and touch it. He moved slowly, carefully, calling Allison's name every few minutes and listening for any response. The forest answered with its usual sounds, frogs, insects, the distant call of a barred owl waking early because of the darkness. Nothing human, nothing helpful. Then he saw the marks on the trees. Not carved, like the one back at the campsite. These were scratched into the bark at various heights, some low to the ground, others 8 or 10 feet up, as if something had climbed the trunks while marking them. The same pattern repeated on tree after tree. 3 curved lines forming that too-wide smile, with the single word riding scratched below. Marcus felt his skin prickle despite the heat. This was wrong. This was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The marks formed a trail of sorts leading deeper into the swamp, and against every instinct that told him to stop, to go back, to radio for backup, he followed them. The ground was almost completely submerged here, the water dark and still, reflecting the trees above like black glass. Marcus waded through it slowly, trying not to think about what might be moving beneath the surface. His radio crackled with periodic check-ins from the other searchers. Nothing to report, no signs, no trace. He was perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the campsite when he entered a small clearing where the water pooled deeper, creating a still pond surrounded by massive cypress trees. The silence here was absolute. No frogs, no insects, no birds, just the sound of his own breathing and the soft ripple of water around his legs as he waded in. And there, in the center of the pond, floating face down in the dark water, was a body. Marcus's heart stopped. He surged forward, moving as fast as he could through the waist-deep water, reaching the figure in seconds and turning it over, already dreading what he'd find. But it wasn't Allison Brenner. It was something else. Something that might have been human once but wasn't anymore. The skin was wrong, too loose, too empty, like a deflated balloon. The face was slack, expressionless, the eyes open but clouded over, and most disturbing of all, the skin seemed to be separating from the body itself, peeling away in places as if it were nothing more than a garment that could be removed. Marcus recoiled, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a drowning victim. This wasn't any kind of death he'd ever encountered. This was something else entirely, something that violated every natural law he understood. And then the skin moved. Not the body, the skin itself. It rippled, contracted, began to pull away from the flesh beneath as if it were alive, as if it had its own intentions. Marcus scrambled backward through the water, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and as he watched in horror, the skin separated completely from the corpse and began to fold itself, compact itself, become something else. It happened fast. One moment it was human skin, recognizable even in its wrongness. The next it was something that had no name, something that existed between forms, neither flesh nor shadow but something that contained elements of both. It hung in the air above the floating corpse for a moment, rippling like cloth in an invisible wind, and Marcus could see the shape of it now. The shape of a human figure, but hollow, empty, waiting to be filled. And then it looked at him. It had no eyes, no face, but he could feel its attention like a physical weight, could feel it seeing him, evaluating him, deciding whether he was worth the effort. The air around it shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with the August humidity. The smell hit him then. The same smell that had been in Allison's tent, sweet and rotten, flowers and decay mixed together in a combination that made his stomach turn. Marcus's hand went to his radio automatically. He needed to report this, needed to call for help. But when he tried to speak, no sound came out. His throat was closed, his vocal cords frozen. The thing in the air rippled again and he felt pressure on his chest. Not physical, but real nonetheless. The same pressure Allison had felt. The same weight that came in the night. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. The boo hag. She slip out her skin at night, go riding on folks while they sleep, stealing they breath, stealing they life. You gotta keep salt by your bed, child. Gotta keep the broom by the door. For day clean, she got to find her skin again and put it back on, else the daylight catch her and burn her up like paper and fire. But she's clever. She's patient. She remember who tried to stop her, and she come back for them later. The thing moved closer. Marcus could feel it now, hovering just inches from his face, and he realized with absolute certainty that if he let it touch him, if he let it press against his chest and steal his breath the way it had stolen Allison's, he would never leave this swamp. He would become like the corpse floating in the water, empty, used up, discarded like an old garment when the boo hag was finished with him. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The radio on his belt crackled, Janet's voice distant and distorted. All units, this is base. Weather conditions deteriorating. Lightning strikes within 5 miles. Mandatory retreat to staging area. I repeat, mandatory retreat. The sound seemed to break whatever hold the thing had on him. Marcus sucked in air, his lungs burning, and found he could move again. He turned and ran, thrashing through the water without any thought of stealth or caution, driven by pure animal panic. Behind him he could hear, or feel, or imagine, the boo hag following, moving through the air above the water with that same soft padding sound he'd heard at Allison's tent. He crashed through the undergrowth, scraping his arms on branches, splashing through water that seemed to grab at his legs like hands trying to pull him down. The forest was darker now, the storm clouds overhead blocking what little light remained. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed seconds later by thunder that seemed to shake the ground itself. His radio crackled again. Marcus, do you copy? Report your position. He grabbed for it, nearly dropping it in the water, and managed to gasp out, I'm heading back, I'm coming. Are you injured? You sound... Just move. Everyone needs to get out of here now. He didn't wait for a response. He could see the marked trees now, the ones with the scratched faces, and he followed them backward like a trail of breadcrumbs, praying they would lead him back to the campsite, back to the team, back to something that made sense. The first drops of rain started falling, huge warm drops that felt like they had weight to them. The wind picked up, making the Spanish moss swing wildly, and the forest filled with the sound of branches creaking and leaves rustling. Nature's chaos, familiar and safe compared to what he'd just witnessed. He burst into the clearing at Cedar Creek campsite to find the rest of the team already there, securing their gear and preparing to evacuate. They all turned to look at him, and he must have looked as wild and terrified as he felt because Janet immediately came over and grabbed his shoulders. What happened? Did you find something? Marcus opened his mouth to answer and found he didn't know what to say. How do you explain what he'd seen? How do you tell experienced rescue professionals that the missing person was taken by something from folklore? Something that shouldn't exist but did? Something that wore human skin like a coat and rode people's breath in the night? He started, then stopped. I found a body. In the water. But it's not Allison. Where? Maybe 3/4 of a mile west. But we can't. We need to leave. Now. Janet's eyes narrowed. Marcus, if there's a body, that changes everything. We need to secure the scene, document. It's not safe. The words came out more forcefully than he intended. Janet, please trust me. We need to leave this area right now. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. We'll retreat to the staging area, ride out the storm, and return tomorrow with a larger team. You can show us the location then. But Marcus, are you sure you're okay? He wasn't. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. But he nodded anyway, and the team began their evacuation, moving quickly through the forest as the storm intensified around them. Lightning flashed overhead now, bright enough to leave after images. Thunder followed immediately, so loud it felt like being inside a drum. The rain became a downpour, turning the trail into a stream. They made it back to the parking area by 6:15, soaked and exhausted. The other searchers dispersed to their vehicles, promising to return at first light. Janet pulled Marcus aside before she left. That body you found, she said quietly. You're sure it wasn't Allison Brenner? I'm sure. Then we have 2 missing persons now, or 1 missing and 1 dead. She paused. What do you think happened out there, Marcus? He looked past her at the forest, at the trees swaying in the wind, at the darkness gathering between the trunks. I don't know, he lied, but I don't think we're going to find Allison alive. Janet's expression softened. Hey, we don't give up. Not until we have proof. People survive in the woods for days, sometimes weeks. There's still hope. Marcus nodded, but he knew better. He'd seen what was left when the boo-hag was finished. He'd seen the empty skin floating in the water, the body drained of everything that made it human. And he'd felt the thing itself, felt its attention, felt it deciding whether he was worth taking. Allison Brenner was gone. Not lost, not injured. Gone in a way that no search and rescue team could fix, taken by something that existed in the spaces between daylight and dark, between sleep and waking, between the old stories and the new world that pretended such things didn't exist. He drove back to his apartment in Columbia in a daze, barely aware of the storm raging around him. The news on the radio reported that Tropical Storm Claudette was making landfall near Charleston, bringing heavy rainfall and wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Flooding was expected throughout the Low Country. The Congaree River was rising. All parks in the region were closed until further notice. Marcus's apartment felt too bright, too modern, too far removed from what he'd experienced. He stood in the shower for 20 minutes trying to wash away the smell of the swamp, but he could still detect it underneath the soap and shampoo. That sweet, rotten smell that didn't belong in the natural world. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the weight on his chest, felt the boo hag sitting on him, riding him, stealing his breath. He kept the lights on, kept the television playing, kept moving around the apartment like motion itself would keep the darkness at bay. But he knew it was only temporary. The thing had seen him, had marked him, just like it had marked Allison, and sooner or later, when he finally let his guard down, when exhaustion forced him to sleep, it would come back. They always came back. The official search for Allison Brenner continued for 5 more days after the storm passed. The team expanded to include K-9 units, helicopter support, and volunteers from 3 counties. They found nothing. No body, no evidence, no trace of where she'd gone or what had happened to her. The corpse Marcus had seen in the pond was never found either. He led 3 separate teams back to the location, but the storm had changed the landscape, flooding areas that had been barely wet before, washing away landmarks he'd used for navigation. The clearing with the deep pool simply wasn't there anymore, or maybe it had never been there at all, existing only in that liminal space between reality and nightmare. After 2 weeks, the search was officially suspended. Allison Brenner was listed as missing, presumed dead, though her body was never recovered. The official report cited the storm, the rising floodwaters, and the dangerous conditions in the swamp as probable causes. Accidental drowning or exposure seemed most likely. These things happened in wilderness areas. Tragic, but not uncommon. Marcus requested a transfer. He submitted the paperwork 3 days after the search was suspended, citing personal reasons and a need for a change of environment. His supervisors were understanding. He'd been through a traumatic experience, finding evidence of a death even if the body couldn't be recovered. A change of scenery would probably be good for him. The transfer was approved, but it would take 6 weeks to process. 6 weeks during which Marcus would need to continue his duties at Congaree, continue walking the trails where Allison had disappeared, continue pretending that everything was normal. He lasted 4 weeks. The boo hag came for him on a Tuesday night in September. He woke from a sleep he couldn't remember falling into to find himself paralyzed, chest compressed by impossible weight, breath being stolen with each exhale of those massive invisible lungs. He could smell it, flowers and rot. Could feel it, patient, ancient, hungry. Could sense it remembering him, recognizing him, punishing him for having seen what he wasn't supposed to see. It rode him for hours, or maybe minutes. Time stopped meaning anything. All that existed was the breathing, the weight, the slow draining sensation of everything he was being pulled out and consumed by something that had no right to exist, but did anyway, had existed for generations, would continue to exist long after he was gone. When it finally released him, when dawn broke and the thing retreated back to wherever it went during daylight hours, Marcus lay shaking in his bed and knew he couldn't go back to Congaree. Couldn't finish his last 2 weeks, couldn't pretend anymore. He called in sick that morning, called in sick the next day. The day after that, he resigned entirely, forfeiting his last paycheck and accumulated leave time. He packed his apartment in a single afternoon, threw everything in his car and drove north without any particular destination in mind. Just away. Away from the low country. Away from the swamp. Away from the trees that held too many memories and the water that reflected things that shouldn't exist. But the boo hag followed him anyway. Not every night. That would have been almost easier. Something he could prepare for, could defend against. It came randomly. Once a week, sometimes twice, sometimes not for a month. Just often enough to keep him off balance, to prevent him from ever feeling truly safe. It would find him wherever he slept. Whether in a motel room in Virginia or a cheap apartment in Ohio, or the spare bedroom of a friend's house in Michigan. Distance didn't matter. Locks didn't matter. Salt and brooms and all the old protections his grandmother had taught him, none of it mattered. The boo hag had marked him, and it would ride him until there was nothing left to take. Marcus found work at a national forest in Montana, as far from the coastal swamps as he could get. The dry mountain air felt like a different planet. The pine forests bore no resemblance to the flooded hardwoods of Congaree. He told himself the change would help, that the thing couldn't follow him across such a vast distance to such a different ecosystem. But on his first night in his new ranger station quarters, in a building surrounded by mountains and sagebrush and air so dry it cracked his lips, he woke to find himself paralyzed, a familiar weight pressing on his chest, a familiar smell filling the room. And he heard it then clearly for the first time, the boo-hag's voice humming that old tune, the one his grandmother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. The low country song, the work song, the song that had traveled across the ocean from West Africa, had survived the Middle Passage, had been passed down through generations who knew that some things were real, even when the modern world insisted they weren't. The song that meant, "I'm writing you, you're mine now, and you always will be." Marcus stopped fighting after that. What was the point? He continued his work, did his job, walked the trails and helped visitors and filed reports, but he was diminished, growing more hollow with each visit, each night of stolen breath. His colleagues noticed but didn't comment. He'd been through trauma, they reasoned. He'd witnessed a death. These things changed people. They didn't know the half of it. Sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, Marcus thought about Allison Brenner, wondered if she'd known what was happening to her, wondered if she'd felt the same slow draining, the same inevitable consumption, wondered if some part of her still existed somewhere, trapped in the skin the boo-hag had stolen, forced to watch as the thing wore her face and hunted new victims. He hoped not. He hoped she'd been released, that whatever the boo-hag had taken from her had at least granted her oblivion. But he suspected the truth was worse, suspected she was still there, somewhere, aware and trapped and unable to do anything but scream silently while the thing that had stolen her life continued its patient ancient work. The carving at Cedar Creek campsite was never removed. It was still there, Marcus knew, scratched into that cypress tree. The face with its too wide smile, the single word, writing, still there waiting for the next camper, the next visitor, the next person who would look at it and not understand until it was far too late. Still there, marking the territory, announcing what lived in those woods, what had always lived there, what would continue to live there long after the park was gone and the trees had fallen and the swamp had reclaimed everything humans had tried to build. The boo-hag was patient. The boo-hag was eternal. And the boo-hag never forgot. Marcus learned that lesson well. He carried it with him every day, felt it with every stolen breath, knew it with a certainty deeper than bone. Some things can't be escaped. Some things can't be fought. Some things simply are, existing in the dark spaces of the world, in the old stories that people stopped believing, waiting patiently for the moment when someone ventures too far into the woods and the night comes and the breathing begins. And when that happens, all you can do is close your eyes and hope it's over quickly. Though it never is. It never is. Location: Olympic National Park, Washington. Date: August 12, 2019. The helicopter dropped Allison Chen at Sunrise Ridge Lookout on June 28th, and she wouldn't see another human face for 42 days. That was the deal. 6 weeks alone in a 14 by 14-foot cabin on stilts, 60 feet above the forest floor, watching for smoke plumes that would signal wildfire. 6 weeks of solitude, silence, and a job so simple a child could do it. Point the Osborne firefinder at the smoke, call in the coordinates, let someone else handle the rest. It was exactly what Allison needed. She'd spent the previous 8 months in Seattle, in an apartment that never felt safe, with a man whose voice could turn a simple question into an interrogation. Where did you go? Who did you talk to? Why are you lying to me? The therapist had used words like coercive control and emotional abuse, but Allison just knew that she'd started to feel like she was disappearing, like her own thoughts weren't trustworthy anymore. The lookout job was escape. Real, physical, undeniable distance. No cell service, no internet, no way for anyone to reach her except the Forest Service radio that connected her to the ranger station 30 miles away, down in the Kenow Valley. The first week had been perfect. Allison learned the routine quickly. Wake with the sun, heat water on the propane stove for instant coffee, scan the horizon with binoculars in a slow 360-degree sweep. The forest stretched in every direction. Douglas fir, western hemlock, Sitka spruce creating a carpet of green so thick it looked solid enough to walk on. The Olympic Mountains rose to the east, still snow-capped even in late June. To the west, she could see a sliver of the Pacific Ocean on clear days, a line of blue at the edge of the world. The days developed a rhythm. Morning scan. Breakfast, usually oatmeal. Read a book. Noon scan. Lunch. Afternoon scan. More reading or sketching or writing in the journal her therapist had suggested. Evening scan as the sun set and turned the forest into layers of shadow. Dinner. Radio check-in with the ranger station. Sunrise Ridge. This is Kino Station. Evening check-in. Quinault, this is Sunrise Ridge. All clear today. No smoke, visibility good, winds light from the west. Copy that, Sunrise. Weather tomorrow looks clear. We're showing high fire danger for the region, so stay sharp. Will do. Sunrise Ridge clear. The radio would click off and Allison would be alone again with the sound of wind in the trees, the distant call of ravens, the creak of the tower when gusts hit it. At night she'd read by lantern light until her eyes grew heavy, then climb into the narrow cot and sleep more deeply than she had in years. No one asking where she was. No one monitoring how long she spent in the bathroom. No one going through her phone while she slept. Just Allison, the forest, and the sky. By the second week, she'd developed small rituals. Coffee drunk from the same chipped mug while watching sunrise. A walk around the catwalk circling the cabin every afternoon, exactly 20 times around, counting steps. Lunch eaten while sitting in the doorway, legs dangling over the edge, 60 feet of empty air below. The repetition was soothing, predictable, safe. She talked to herself sometimes just to hear a human voice. Okay, Allison, let's do the noon scan. Starting north, nothing. Northeast, nothing. East, clear. Southeast. It felt silly but normal. The ranger who'd trained her, a weathered man named Tom with 30 years in fire lookouts, had mentioned it. Everyone talks to themselves up here. Don't worry about it. It's when you start getting answers from someone who isn't there that you should worry. He'd laughed when he said it. Allison thought about that joke often during the third week, when she started hearing the voices. It began small. A sound that might have been someone calling from the forest below. A distant hello that could have been a bird's cry or wind through a particular stand of trees. Allison would lean over the catwalk railing, binoculars ready, scanning for hikers. Nothing. The forest was empty. Olympic National Park was vast, nearly 1 million acres, and the Sunrise Ridge lookout sat in one of the most remote sections. The nearest trail was 4 miles away. Hikers almost never came this deep into the backcountry, and even if they did, they wouldn't be calling up at the tower. There was no trail to it. The only access was by helicopter. Still, sound carried strangely in the forest. Maybe someone was on a distant ridge, their voice bouncing through the valleys in unexpected ways. Allison went back to her book and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. The next day, she heard it again. This time it was clearer. Hello? Is anyone there? A woman's voice, young, coming from somewhere below the tower. Allison grabbed the binoculars and did a full sweep. The forest was thick. Visibility only extended maybe 200 feet before the canopy became too dense. But she should have been able to see movement, a flash of bright hiking gear, something. Nothing. Hello? Allison called down. Where are you? No response. She waited 5 minutes, then 10, watching the forest. The wind moved through the trees in waves, creating patterns of light and shadow that looked almost like people moving, but were just branches swaying. Allison's heart rate slowly returned to normal. Auditory hallucination, maybe. The ranger had mentioned that too, in passing. Isolation does weird things to your brain. You might hear things that aren't there, see things in your peripheral vision. It's normal. The brain doesn't like being understimulated, it makes up its own entertainment. Allison tried to accept that explanation, but the voice had sounded so real, so clear, not like wind or birds or any natural sound she'd heard in 3 weeks of living above the forest. That night during radio check-in, she almost mentioned it to the ranger station. But what would she say? I heard a voice and I'm scared. They'd think she was cracking already 3 weeks in. They'd pull her out, send someone more experienced. And then where would she go? Back to Seattle? Back to the apartment where she'd felt like she was losing her mind? No, she could handle some auditory hallucinations. She was fine. Everything was fine. Sunrise Ridge. This is Kino Station. Evening check-in. Kino, Sunrise Ridge. All clear. No smoke. Visibility excellent. No concerns. Copy that. You doing okay up there, Allison? You sound tired. I'm good. Just ready for sleep. Fair enough. Get some rest. Kino clear. Allison set the radio down and looked out the windows at the darkening forest. The sun had set, leaving the world in that strange twilight where shapes became ambiguous and distances were impossible to judge. The trees seemed closer than they had during the day, their branches reaching upward like hands. She closed the shutters, metal panels that locked from the inside, turning the lookout into a sealed box, and lit the lantern. The ranger manual suggested leaving at least one window open for ventilation. But tonight, Allison wanted barriers. Walls, something between her and whatever was out there. She climbed into her cot and pulled the sleeping bag up to her chin, even though it wasn't cold. The lookout creaked in the wind, a sound she'd grown used to. Settling sounds, expansion and contraction. Normal. Then from outside, very close. Allison? She froze. Her name. Someone had said her name. Allison, are you awake? It was a man's voice. Familiar. It took her a moment to place it, and when she did, her blood went cold. It sounded exactly like David, her ex-boyfriend, the one she'd left, the one who didn't know where she'd gone because she'd been careful, so careful, to leave no forwarding address, to tell only her sister and her therapist where she'd be. I know you're in there, Allison, I just want to talk. This wasn't possible. David was in Seattle. David had no way of knowing where she was. David couldn't have followed her here, couldn't have climbed a 60-foot tower in the dark without her hearing it, but the voice was his. Every inflection, every familiar cadence that she'd learned to interpret for signs of oncoming anger. Allison lay perfectly still, not breathing. The lookout had no lock on the door. Fire lookouts were supposed to be accessible to anyone seeking emergency shelter. There was just a simple latch. If someone was really outside, they could open it. Allison, this is childish. Open the door. The voice was getting annoyed now. That edge creeping in, the one that meant she'd done something wrong, broken some invisible rule. But it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Tom's words came back to her. Isolation does weird things to your brain. This was a hallucination. A very specific, very cruel hallucination based on her fears. The brain making up entertainment, filling silence with the thing she was most afraid of hearing. Allison forced herself to take a slow breath. Then another. She counted to 60, then to 60 again. The voice outside continued for a few more minutes. Allison, I'm getting angry now. You know what happens when you make me angry. And then stopped. Silence returned. Just wind and trees. Allison didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, she opened the shutters with shaking hands. The forest was beautiful. Morning mist rising from the canopy, ravens calling, everything washed clean by dew. Normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be. There was no one on the catwalk, no footprints in the dust, no signs anyone had been there. Hallucination. It had been a hallucination. Allison made coffee with trembling hands and did her morning scan. Clear skies, no smoke, everything exactly as it was supposed to be. She radioed in her morning report, keeping her voice steady and professional. Any concerns up there? The ranger asked. None, all clear. She spent the day trying to convince herself she was fine, read 3 chapters of her book without retaining a single word, ate lunch without tasting it, did her afternoon scan and saw smoke in every shadow until she looked directly at it and it resolved into nothing. The sun set too quickly. As twilight fell, Allison made a decision. She would not close the shutters tonight. She would prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. The voice had been her imagination, her brain playing tricks. Closing the shutters would be giving in to irrational fear. And she'd spent 8 months learning to recognize when fear was being used to control her. She would not be controlled. Not anymore. Not even by her own mind. Night came. Allison sat at the desk with her book, the lantern casting warm light across the pages. Outside the windows, the forest was a wall of darkness. She read, forcing herself to focus on the words. At 9:47 p.m., she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not imagined, not ambiguous. Clear, distinct footsteps. Someone climbing the 60 feet of wooden stairs that spiraled up to the lookout platform. Allison stood slowly, moving toward the window. The stairs were on the north side. She looked out. Nothing visible. Too dark. But she could hear them. Step, step, step. A steady rhythm, climbing higher. She grabbed the radio. Kino station, this is Sunrise Ridge. I have a situation. Someone is climbing my tower. Repeat, someone is accessing the lookout. I need immediate assistance. Static answered her. She tried again. Kino station, do you copy? This is an emergency. More static, then a voice breaking through. Not alone. Never alone. Been watching. That wasn't the ranger station. That wasn't any voice she recognized. The footsteps reached the catwalk. Allison could hear them circling the cabin now, slow and deliberate. Walking around and around, just outside the walls, she backed into the center of the room holding the radio like a weapon. Who are you? What do you want? The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Then a voice, soft, almost gentle. Allison, you know who I am. You've always known. Let me in. It wasn't David's voice anymore. It was her mother's voice. Her mother who lived in California and who Allison hadn't spoken to in 3 years after a fight about the relationship she refused to leave. You were right, sweetheart. About everything. I should have listened, I'm sorry. Please, let me in, I came all this way to apologize. Tears started running down Allison's face before she could stop them. How many times had she wanted to hear those words? How many nights had she rehearsed the conversation where her mother finally understood, finally believed her? Her hand reached for the door latch, then stopped. Her mother was in California. Her mother didn't know where she was. Her mother couldn't have climbed this tower, and beneath the words, beneath the perfect imitation of her mother's voice, Allison heard something else. A sound like branches scraping together, like wind through hollow wood, like something that had learned to shape human words, but had never been human itself. No, Allison whispered. The voice outside changed. No longer her mother. Now it was her sister. Allison, it's me. Something's wrong. I need help. Please open the door. Then her therapist. Allison, this behavior is concerning. We need to talk about your paranoia. Then David again. You can't hide from me forever, you know that. Then Tom, the ranger who'd trained her. Allison, check your fire finder. There's smoke. You need to see this. Then her own voice. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. A dozen voices cycling through everyone she knew, everyone she'd ever known, all begging or commanding or manipulating. Each voice perfect, exact, impossible. Allison pressed her hands over her ears, but she could still hear them. Not through her ears, through her bones vibrating up from the floorboards. She grabbed the ranger manual from the shelf, the one Tom had left, and flipped frantically through pages about weather patterns and radio codes and fire behavior, until she found what she was half remembering. A section near the back, handwritten in faded ink. An addendum someone had added years ago. Additional notes for Olympic Peninsula. Lookouts. The Salish peoples have long traditions about the forests here. If you hear voices at night, especially voices of people you know, do not respond. Do not engage. Do not open your door. They call them stick Indians or wood people. They can mimic any sound they've heard. They collect voices like we collect firewood. If you answer them, they learn your voice too. And once they have your voice, they can call others using it. Stay inside. Do not look directly at them. Wait for dawn. They do not like daylight. If you must go outside, carry iron. They cannot abide iron. The entry ended there, unsigned, undated. Someone had written it and left it as a warning. Allison looked at her supplies. No iron, aluminum cookware, steel ladder, but she had no idea if steel would work. Iron, the note said. Specific. The voices outside had merged into a cacophony now. A chorus of everyone she'd ever known, all speaking at once, all demanding she open the door. And underneath it, that sound. Branches breaking, wood creaking, wind through hollow spaces where a throat should be. "I know what you are," Allison said, her voice shaking but clear. "You're not real. None of you are real. And I'm not opening this door." The voices stopped. Absolute silence, more complete than any silence should be in the forest at night. Then a single voice, low and old, and speaking in a language Allison didn't understand. Words that sounded like trees rubbing together in wind, like the forest itself learning to speak. Something scraped against the windows, not hands but branches. Long, thin, wrong. Tapping out a rhythm, testing the glass. Allison stood in the center of the room, holding the lantern, and waited for dawn. The voices came every night after that. Always at twilight when the light was failing. Always starting with familiar voices. Her mother, her sister, David, friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Cycling through everyone she'd ever cared about, looking for the combination that would make her open the door. During the day, the forest was normal. Allison did her scans, reported clear skies, maintained her routine. She found she could function on 3 hours of sleep, 4 if she was lucky. She stopped closing her eyes during the day, afraid of what she might hear when she wasn't watching. The radio became unreliable. Sometimes it worked fine, and the ranger station answered her check-ins normally. Sometimes it dissolved into static and voices that weren't quite human, speaking in frequencies that made her teeth ache. She learned to tell the difference. Real radio transmissions had a specific click when the transmission ended. The other voices had no click, just a sense of something listening on the other end, waiting for her to say the wrong thing. She found the iron by accident during the 4th week, cleaning supplies under the sink, and there, behind the bottles of bleach and dish soap, an old railroad spike. Rusty, heavy, cold to the touch. She had no idea what it was doing in a fire lookout tower, but she carried it with her constantly after that, slept with it under her pillow. The next time the voices came, she held the spike and said nothing. The tapping on the windows continued for hours but never broke through. The thing outside seemed frustrated, angry. The voices grew harsher, more desperate, but it did not come inside. Dawn always brought relief. The voices would fade with the darkness, and Allison would open the shutters to find the forest peaceful again. Birds singing, normal sounds. She'd make her coffee and do her morning scan and pretend everything was fine. But she was losing weight. She could feel her ribs now when she touched her side. Food tasted like ash. Sleep came in stolen minutes, never deep enough to dream. Her hands shook constantly. During the evening check-in on day 34, the ranger asked again, "Allison, you doing okay? You sound rough." "I'm fine, just tired." "When was the last time you got a full night's sleep?" "I sleep fine." "We can rotate you out early if you need. No shame in it. This job isn't for everyone." And go where? Back to Seattle? Back to a world where she had to watch her back, where every notification on her phone might be David finding her again? "I'm fine," she repeated. 2 more weeks. I can make 2 more weeks." "Your call. But if you need extraction, just say the word." "Copy that." That night, the thing outside changed tactics. Instead of voices calling from beyond the door, it started speaking from inside the lookout. Allison was sitting at the desk eating cold beans from a can when she heard her own voice behind her. "You're not going to make it." She spun around. The cabin was empty. Just her cot, her supplies, her pack. Nothing else. 2 more weeks, her voice said, but she wasn't speaking. You can't last 2 more weeks. Shut up, Allison whispered. You're losing your mind. You know that, right? This is what crazy feels like. David was right about you. You're unstable, paranoid, making up threats that don't exist. You're not real. Then why are you answering? Her voice laughed. Allison's laugh, but wrong, too sharp. Why are you talking to yourself, Allison? That's not healthy. She grabbed the railroad spike and held it up. Iron. You can't touch iron. I'm not touching anything. I'm inside your head now. You let me in when you listened. Every time you answered, every time you acknowledged the voices, you opened a door. Not that door. Allison's voice laughed again. A different door, the one inside you. This isn't real. Then prove it. Open the door. Go outside. If I'm not real, there's nothing to be afraid of. Allison's hand moved toward the latch. She watched it move, watched her fingers reach for the metal and couldn't stop them. Some part of her brain had disconnected from her motor control. She was a passenger in her own body. That's it. Just open it. Let's settle this once and for all. Her fingers touched the latch. The radio crackled to life. Sunrise Ridge. This is Kino Station. Emergency transmission. We have reports of a lightning strike in your sector. Do you copy? Real radio. Real voice. The click at the end of the transmission. Allison yanked her hand back from the door and grabbed the radio. Kino, I copy. Where's the strike? Approximately 2 miles northeast of your position. Are you seeing smoke? She grabbed the binoculars and did a scan of the northeast sector. There, a thin column of gray rising above the tree line. An actual fire, an actual emergency. Something real and concrete and part of the job she was here to do. Confirmed. Single smoke column, thin, approximately 2 miles northeast. Appears to be early stage. Copy that. Fire crew is mobilizing. Keep monitoring and report any changes. Will do. Sunrise Ridge standing by. The voice inside the cabin was silent. Allison spent the rest of the night tracking the fire. It stayed small. The lightning strike had hit a snag, a standing dead tree, which burned bright and hot but didn't spread to the surrounding forest. By morning, the fire crew had reached it and called in containment. But it had given Allison something. Focus. Purpose. A reminder that she was here to do a job, and she was good at her job. The voices, whatever they were, hallucination or something worse, couldn't change that. She'd survived David's mind games for 2 years. She'd survived by learning to trust herself, by learning to distinguish real threats from manufactured ones, by learning that sometimes the voice telling you you're crazy is the one you should ignore most of all. The thing in the forest was doing the same thing David had done, trying to make her doubt herself, trying to make her believe she was the problem, trying to isolate her from reality until she had no choice but to rely on it for truth. But Allison had learned that game, and she'd learned how to win. The last 2 weeks were the hardest. The thing stopped pretending, stopped using familiar voices, started using sounds it had collected from the forest. A child crying, an injured animal screaming, a woman calling for help. The sounds animals and people make when they're dying. Allison stopped responding, stopped acknowledging. She did her job, tracked weather patterns, reported clear skies, and when night fell, she sat in the center of the room with the railroad spike and waited for dawn. The thing grew frustrated. The sounds outside became less controlled, more raw. Branches breaking, something large moving around the tower, the whole structure shaking as it climbed and descended, testing the walls. But it never came inside. On day 42, the helicopter arrived. Allison saw it coming from miles away, heard the thump of rotors echoing across the valleys. She gathered her pack, cleaned the lookout, left everything exactly as she'd found it. The Ranger manual with its handwritten warning went back on the shelf for the next person. When the helicopter touched down on the small landing pad beside the tower, Tom was piloting. He waved at her, shouting something she couldn't hear over the engine noise. Allison climbed in, strapped herself into the seat, and didn't look back as they lifted off. Below, the forest spread out in endless green. Beautiful, vast, ancient, and somewhere down there, something watched her go. Tom handed her a headset. His voice crackled through. "You did good up there. 42 days, that's a full rotation." "Yeah. You look rough, though. You okay?" Allison looked out at the forest sliding past below. "I heard things at night. Most people do. Isolation plays tricks." "These weren't tricks." Tom was quiet for a moment, then, "My grandfather was Salish. He told me stories about the Olympics. About things that live in the deep forest away from the trails. Things that learn to speak by listening. He said they're always there, always watching, but they only speak to people who are alone. What do they want? Company, maybe. Or maybe they're just curious. Or maybe they're testing us, seeing what we're made of." He glanced at her. "The fact that you're sitting here means you passed." "I didn't feel like I passed, I felt like I was going crazy. The line between those two things gets real thin sometimes, but you didn't open the door. That's what matters." The helicopter flew on, carrying her away from Sunrise Ridge, back toward civilization, back toward a world with other people and noise and light. Allison closed her eyes, listening to the engine, letting the vibration travel through her bones. She thought about the railroad spike in her pack. She'd kept it. A reminder, maybe. Or a tool. Just in case. Because the thing she'd learned, up in that tower, wasn't just about surviving isolation. It was about learning to trust her own mind again. Learning that sometimes the scary voice telling you you're broken is the real threat. And the voice telling you to hold on, to wait for dawn, to trust yourself, is the one worth listening to. Allison returned to Seattle 3 days later. She moved into a new apartment, 3rd floor, door painted blue, a broom hanging by the entrance. Superstition, maybe, but she'd learned that some traditions exist for good reasons. David tried to contact her twice. She blocked him both times without reading the messages. Whatever power his voice had once held was gone. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. The nightmares came for a while. Dreams of being back in the tower, hearing the voices, reaching for the door latch. But they faded. Slowly, but they faded. 6 months later, she got an email from the Forest Service. They were looking for experienced lookouts for the next summer season. Sunrise Ridge was available. Would she be interested in another rotation? Allison stared at the email for a long time. Her therapist would probably say it was a bad idea, that she needed more recovery time, that going back to the place where she'd nearly broken wasn't healthy. But Allison remembered something else. She hadn't broken. She'd bent. She'd barely held on. But she hadn't broken. And there was something powerful in that. Something she didn't want to lose. She typed her response. "Yes, I'm interested." Because here's what Allison had learned, both from David and from the thing in the forest. The voices that try to control you only have the power you give them. They can't make you open the door. They can't make you doubt yourself unless you let them. And she was done letting them. The Yanault Ranger Station keeps a file on Sunrise Ridge Lookout. It's thicker than the files for other lookouts, full of incident reports that never quite explain what happened. 1994. Lookout reported voices in the trees and requested early extraction after 3 weeks. 2001. Lookout abandoned post without notice. Found walking on a forest road 12 miles away, claiming they wouldn't stop calling. 2008. Lookout completed full rotation, but filed a report about non-standard auditory phenomena that was archived without follow-up. 2015. Lookout hospitalized for exhaustion and dehydration. Claimed she stopped sleeping because of the visitors. 2019. Allison Chen completed a full 42-day rotation, filed no incident reports, requested return assignment for the following season. The ranger who manages the file sometimes looks at that 2019 entry and wonders what the difference was. What made Allison survive when others broke? The answer isn't in the file. The answer is in the things Allison learned in that tower during 42 nights of voices calling her name. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's outside your door. Sometimes it's the voice inside your head telling you that you deserve to be afraid. And sometimes survival means learning the difference between the two. Tom retired the next year. His replacement, a young ranger named Katie, asked him about Sunrise Ridge during the handoff. "I've read the files. What's actually going on up there?" Tom thought about his grandfather's stories, about things in the forest that collect voices like people collect photographs, about how loneliness can open doors that should stay closed, about the difference between superstition and survival. "My advice," he said finally, "when you brief people for that posting, tell them 3 things. 1. Bring iron. 2. Don't answer voices you can't see. 3. The forest is older than we are, and sometimes it likes to remind us of that." "That's not a real answer." "No," Tom agreed, "but it's the only answer I've got." Katie sent Allison back to Sunrise Ridge in June 2020. Allison packed the same railroad spike, the same supplies, the same determination. The voices came again that summer. They always did. But Allison knew them now, knew their patterns, knew how to sit in silence while they raged outside her walls, knew that dawn always came, knew that surviving meant holding on to yourself even when everything around you insisted you were the problem. She completed another full rotation. And another, the summer after that. People started calling her the Sunrise Ridge Specialist, the one who could handle the isolation, the silence, the peculiar challenges of that particular posting. They didn't know the real reason she kept going back. The real reason was this. In that tower, 60 feet above the forest floor, surrounded by voices trying to make her doubt herself, Allison had learned she was stronger than the things that tried to break her, and that was a lesson worth remembering. Every single summer.